So thanks for coming. The next few minutes, I'm going to take on Larry Lawton, 1987 paper, which essentially is this is a chapter in the book that opens up sort of our response. The book actually includes papers by philosophers, people who are interested in sociology of science, people who are interested in history of science, and a few professional skeptics, meaning people that actually spend their time pretty much full-time debunking pseudoscience. So it's a very panorama of pseudoscience. But of course we couldn't start without actually addressing the 1987 paper that has been largely, although not entirely responsible for sort of the stasis in discussions on demarcation for a while. So you can see I'm starting with that slide where it says, the guy says, I was just checking your records, and you have a PhD in pseudoscience, which clearly it's a problem if you're trying to actually do real science. But what is the problem exactly? It seems to me that, broadly speaking, of course, the issue is how do we make sense of the distinctions that we do make between science and pseudoscience. On the left you get astrology, on the right you get astronomy. Now we know that they're different disciplines. We know that one is pseudoscientific, the other one is not. The question is, well, how do we make sense of that distinction? And also what happens when things become more interesting, because there's some fields that actually are not quite as easily classifiable. There are some areas of science that are sort of borderline, and there are some areas that are currently classified often as pseudoscience that in fact may turn out to be interesting in their own right. So the interesting part actually, as far as I'm concerned, is in the borderline areas, the areas that are gray and not quite as sharply divided as astrology and astronomy. The second thing to make clear is, why do we care? Why spend time doing these kind of exercise? And I think there's three reasons why we care. One, of course, is it's intellectually interesting for at least some of us. I hate when people say, well, it's intrinsically interesting, because when they say so, they mean usually it's interesting to me. There's no such thing as intrinsically interesting. But I think there are a number of people, of course, as philosophers, as people who are interested in epistemology, among other things. One is interested in this problem from a purely intellectual perspective. But there are also very practical reasons to be interested in pseudoscience, and I know that often in the audience of philosophers, one doesn't want to necessarily hear about practical things, but we should. One is, of course, is that science gets a lot of money every year from governments and industry throughout the world. So it does make sense to try to understand not only how science itself works, but when those famous borderline areas where it doesn't work as well. For instance, in the United States for a number of years now, the NIH, the National Institute of Health, which funds research, medical research, it has also funded at the tune of several millions of dollars every year research on alternative medicine. And it's a good question to ask, is that really well spent money? How much longer should we be able to spend that money? That sort of thing. And I think the philosophers have something to say about that, sometimes more so than the scientists themselves who are involved in it. The third reason is because pseudoscience kills, or it has negative consequences. That particular picture is of a woman who has a non-AZT tattoo on her pregnant belly. She refused to believe, she denied that there's a connection between the HIV virus and AIDS. And so declined to take medications. The result, of course, is that both her and her baby are now dead. This happened a few years ago. In Africa in particular, this denial of HIV-AIDS connection has caused, directly or indirectly, millions of people to be affected and dying. A number of African governments did not recognize it, still some of them don't recognize that connection. So these are issues of public health. Another example is vaccine skepticism and so on and so forth, or I should say denial, because there's nothing to be skeptical about. So there are both intellectual reasons and practical reasons in terms of money being spent and lives being lost. Now, as you probably know, the demarcation problem originated, at least in the modern era, with Sir Karl Popper. Popper was interested actually in quite a different sort of issue in the beginning. He was interested in Hume's famous problem of induction, and that's why he came up with his famous criterion of falsification for distinguishing profitable scientific enterprises from unprofitable ones. But that led him to make that distinction, and therefore to be interested in what he himself called the demarcation problem. His solution to the demarcation problem was, of course, that science does not make progress by confirmation of hypotheses, because it's too easy to confirm hypotheses you believe in. And his examples of pseudoscience might surprise people who think about pseudoscience these days, but he included Marxist theories of history and pretty much every brand of psychoanalysis among pseudosciences. And there are some really interesting, even amusing anecdotes in Popper's writings about these things, where he goes to a psychoanalyst friend of his and he says, so I've heard of this case, and he describes this case. What do you think of it? And the guy, without flinching for a second, he gives the diagnosis, and Popper says, well, how could you possibly give a diagnosis, given that you haven't even seen the patient, you don't know the details of the case? And the guy responds, well, it's because of my 1,000-fold experience with these cases. I can just do it like that. And Popper's reply was, well, I suppose now your experience is 1,001, even though, in fact, he had not seen the patient in question. The idea was that psychoanalysis, Marxist theories of history, and everything like that, things like that, are compatible with pretty much every sort of evidence, or empirical evidence. And if they're compatible with every sort of evidence, it means that they're not, in fact, testable. They cannot be possibly rejected. What Popper, of course, famously suggested would happen, should happen, is that progress in science is, and what distinguishes science from pseudoscience and non-science, is made by falsifying hypotheses, by rejecting hypotheses that don't work. His best example of a falsifiable and yet scientific hypothesis that survived falsification tests was Einstein's theory of relativity, which was spectacular from just about the time that Popper was running. But for Popper, of course, that didn't mean that the theory was true. It simply meant that it survived yet another test, and it will live another day. But one of these days, in fact, it may fail the test and be discarded, which is the way science proceeds according to makes progress and according to Popper. Now, this is all well and fine, except, of course, for a couple of major wrinkles. Two of those wrinkles are known together as the Dewey-Quine thesis. There are two theses, actually. One was proposed before Popper, in fact, by Pierre Lamb, who was a physicist interested in philosophy of science. And his idea was that scientists often actually continuously adjust what he called the ancillary hypothesis before giving up the focal one, meaning that if a theory fails the falsification test, you cannot necessarily conclude that it is a theory that needs to be thrown out. It could be that one of the other things that go into the making of the theory, for instance, the instrumentation or the assumptions made in calculating the result and so on and so forth. That could be that one of those things that could be adjusted. And so there is an open period of time, the history of science bears this out, there is an open period of time during which scientists actually, if they think that a hypothesis is, or theory is particularly worth investigating, they will actually suspend the falsification test for all that purpose and try to figure out what's wrong and what's not wrong. If of course, the test keeps failing for a long period of time, then eventually scientists will in fact abandon the idea. A broader version of the same idea is, of course, Quine's general notion of knowledge as a web. Science as a web of knowledge. In the case of Quine, of course, he went so far as saying that everything can be in play, including logic itself and laws of logic itself. Whether you go that far or not, the idea is that things are in fact interconnected in our way of understanding the world, and so it could be the problem again. It's not the focal hypothesis one is testing, but it's somewhere along down the line. And again, the only answer that scientists could possibly have to that for a challenge is their intuition. At some point, they will, up to a point, they will look for what may be wrong in the surrounding area of that web of knowledge, and at some point you give up because the hypothesis is simply not holding up for the scrutiny. Okay, so that's the background. Now, let me get to the focal point, which is Loudon's famous 1987 paper that, for all effective purposes, marked the death or near death of the demarcation problem for a number of years. So Loudon suggested that the debate on demarcation hinges on actually three what he called meta-philosophical considerations. I get very nervous when one talk about meta-philosophy. I think that philosophy is complicated enough. It turns out these are actually three standard philosophical issues as far as I'm concerned, but he called them meta-philosophical. So we're going to go through each one of them, and I'm going to give a very brief version of the answer that is then elaborated on in the chapter. The first question, according to Lavin, is what conditions of adequacy should a proper demarcation criterion satisfy? What criteria we use? How do we know that this criterion is actually adequate for separating science from pseudoscience? Fair question. Second meta problem for Lavin was, well, is the demarcation, is the criterion in question offering necessary or sufficient conditions, or both, for scientific status of the theory, and therefore for the pseudoscientific status of the theory? And then the third one is, what actions or judgments are implied, follow from the claim that something is scientific or unscientific. So once you reach the conclusion, according to the criterion, whatever criterion you set down, what does that mean? What does that imply? Let's start with the first. What conditions of adequacy? So Lavin is very clear. He thinks that philosophers need to agree on whatever separation between science and pseudoscience scientists themselves agree on. He says if philosophers come up with something different from what scientists themselves recognize as science or pseudoscience, there's something wrong. Well, no. Because if that were the case, then we could just go home, stop right now and go home and enjoy a nice day. I don't think the philosophers should necessarily roll over and let the scientists decide what counts and what doesn't count. That's the whole, well, maybe not the whole point, but that's a major point of philosophy of science. And I can tell you this as a former active science in evolutionary biology. Most scientists don't know anything or very little about philosophy of science, and they just use certain tools. They don't really necessarily are very cognizant about what those tools are and how they work. So now I don't think that that's a too strict of a criterion. On the other hand, you certainly don't want to get in a situation where philosophers come up with a conclusion according to which, astrology, parapsychology, and so on are sciences, and fundamental physics and evolutionary biology are pseudosciences. If we're going to go that far from the way in which practicing scientists think, then we do have a problem. So I think that it's reasonable that there may be some discrepancies between scientists and philosophers' assessment of the issue, but those discrepancies better not be too wide, otherwise there really is a problem. So I think that the conclusion, whatever it's proposed by philosophers, should look something like that. It's going to be difficult to see on the back, but basically what you have there is a broad classification of sciences where you get things like biology, chemistry, fundamental physics, and all that grouped together in one of those clusters as really hard science. The science is stuff that's clearly undeniable science. At the opposite extreme, you get equally undeniable pseudoscience, intelligent design creation, astrology, and so on and so forth. And then in the middle, you get either pseudoscience that could, in fact, turn into a viable research program, such as some areas of parapsychology, for instance. Or you get some science that could slide back into pseudoscience. I'm thinking of issues like, for instance, evolutionary psychology, or the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Those are areas of science where you can have a reasonable discussion about, how rigorous are they. Certainly they don't seem to be as rigorous as core sciences, but they're certainly not as bad as anything like the actual pseudosciences. So something like that needs to be recovered, but the details we can discuss when appropriate. The second criterion that is, the second question is brought up, or meta question is brought up by Lavin, is what are the necessary and jointly sufficient criteria for demarcation? So he says, for instance, ideally a demarcation criterion would specify a set of legally necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for deciding whether an activity or set of statements is scientific or unscientific. Well, I'm not sure that that's ideal. In fact, I think that would be a bad idea because any interestingly complex concept such as certainly science and pseudoscience probably does not admit a simple definition in terms of necessary and jointly sufficient small set of conditions. We've known this since Wittgenstein started talking about cluster or family resemblance concepts. So I think that actually the answer to what the criteria demarcation is going to be something that looks like this. This is a two-dimensional diagram, but it could very easily be multidimensional. Over here you have sort of some measure of theoretical understanding or theoretical sophistication of that discipline. On the vertical axis you have some measure of empirical reliability and empirical fruitfulness of the same discipline. And those two things begin to separate things like, again, astrology and intelligent design on the lower left corner, physics, chemistry, and biology on the upper right corner, and more interesting things like social sciences on the upper left corner. High in data, heavy in data, but a little scarce in the theoretical understanding. And things over here like string theory physics, which are very high in theoretical content, but very low in practice. Zero in terms of empirical. Now, one can add additional dimensions. One of these dimensions that is important, several of our contributors brought up, is that it has to be a temporal dimension. The distinction between science and pseudoscience varies over time. If we were doing this analysis a century ago, or 2 centuries ago, or 3 centuries ago, things would be moving. So you can imagine in different positions. So you can imagine this as a revolving cube in time, where fields move according to what we know and how we figure it out. The third, you're not giving any single form, okay, right?
There was still
good. The third question, third criterion that Loudon brought up was, what does the judgment imply? And this is a long quote from Loudon, and I hope you don't mind if I should go and read it, because I think it's important. He says, precisely because a demarcation criterion will typically assert the epistemic superiority of science over non-science, the formulation of such criterion will result in the sorting of beliefs into such categories as sound and unsound, respectable and cranky, or reasonable and unreasonable. Philosophers should not judge from formulation of a demarcation criterion merely because it has these judgmental implications associated with it. Quite the reverse. Philosophy at its best should tell us what is reasonable to believe and what is not. But the value-loaded character of the term science and its cognizance in our culture should make us realize that the labeling of a certain activity as scientific or unscientific has social and political ramifications which go well beyond the taxonomic task of sorting beliefs into 2 piles. And when I read this section, I was very puzzled because it looks like Loudon wants eats cake and it wants to eat it too. That's what that diagram says. Have cake, eat it too. The guy off to the left says, well, let's keep this quiet, shall we? This is somewhere in line with Duncan Hines. I mean, it sounds to me like on the one hand, Loudon is saying we shouldn't have any problem in basically making essentially epistemic judgments. That's in fact what philosophy at its best does. But hey, be careful, because if you say that something is in fact scientific or unscientific, reasonable or unreasonable, there are consequences. Well, good, because if there were no consequences, then what would be the point of making the judgment? It would be an entirely sterile intellectual exercise for its own right. As I said in the beginning, one of the reasons these judgments are in fact important, and of course with the idea that these judgments are provisional, and with the idea that these judgments are revisable. But the reason they're important is because they do have practical consequences, social consequences in terms of social impact, monetary impact, and so on and so forth. In other words, I don't think that philosophers should sort of shy away from, for a change, being actually relevant in social discourse by getting out there and saying, no, actually, we do think that this is crap, and we do think this is a good thing, and here's why. We're not the ultimate judge of those. This is part of a conversation that we have with both scientists, of course, and society at large. But we need to have that conversation. I think it's a bad idea to shy away from it. Why do I think it's a bad idea to shy away from it? Because of these kinds of statistics. This is from the National Science Foundation. Oops. These are data over a couple of decades. You can see they haven't changed much. This is the degree of belief of Americans in a number of pseudoscientific notions. Things like ghosts and telepathy and clairvoyance and so on. Depending on which type of pseudoscientific belief you pick, they vary anywhere between 20-30% to up to 50%. In fact, according to certain statistics, certain ways of looking at a statistic, almost 90% of Americans now believe in evolution, not as an entirely naturalistic process of things. Half of them believe that it's directly, the result doesn't occur at all, and 40%, 30 to 40% believe that yeah, it does occur, but it's got the whole thing. It's not a naturalistic process. Those numbers are scary, what they should be, and scientists have finally picked up on the fact that these numbers are important. Over the last 2 decades, a number of scientific societies have actually been more and more actively involved, especially ones that certain people in the American Congress have actually made serious noises about cutting the funding of things like evolutionary biological research, for instance. So scientists are finally becoming aware of it. Philosophers have been aware of it for a long time. And actually, there are cases, which I discuss in my chapter, of philosophers making a real difference. For instance, in a famous case in 2005, a court case in 2005 in Pennsylvania about the teaching of intelligent design, 2 of the major testing witnesses were, in fact, philosophers of science. And if you read the conclusion of the judge, the decision of the judge, it was essentially a philosophy of science 101 little lecture, 40 pages. So we can make a difference. So to summarize, here are the answers to Laden's question. First, what conditions of adequacy should proposes a demarcation criterion satisfy? Well, it should agree, broadly speaking, with what scientists think, but not necessarily in detail. Is the criterion under consideration offering necessary sufficient features or both? No, I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I think it's much more complicated than that. It requires multidimensional criteria, and those criteria may, in fact, change over time. And finally, what actions or judgments are implied by declaring a certain belief scientific or unscientific? Well, philosophers really ought to get into the fray here, not be afraid of providing their expert opinion to the public at large and to scientists in particular, and see what happens. And of course, if you want more, the book is in fact out.